Hello, boys and girls. Thank you again for joining us. We are reading here today Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. I hope you've all had a good weekend and enjoyed some sun, just like I did. And now it's time to get comfortable and listen to a story that is fabulous. So let's quickly recap what we have read so far because we're about to start chapter 13 of this book. So in this book, we were introduced to a little boy named Harry. Harry Potter is someone who grew up in a house of an auntie and uncle who wasn't very kind to him. He had a cousin named Dudley who wasn't very kind to him either, and he had to live in a cupboard under the stairs. Harry grew up believing that his parents had been killed in a car crash, but he received a bunch of letters, and in those letters he was invited to come and go to a school called Hogwarts, and it's a school for witchcraft and wizardry. He was picked up by this giant man named Hagrid, and from Hagrid he finds out that his parents didn't actually die in a car crash, but they were in fact killed by this super evil wizard called Voldemort, and that Harry himself is the only person known to have survived an attack by Voldemort, and that is why Harry has a lightning bolt scar on his forehead. Okay? So Harry goes to this school of witchcraft and wizardry called Hogwarts, and there he's introduced to a bunch of different professors and a bunch of different children, and he's placed into one specific house called Gryffindor. So there is 4 different houses at the school. There's Gryffindor, Slytherin, Hufflepuff, and Ravenclaw. And those houses can gain points throughout the year, and that's where the kids will go and they will sleep, and they have certain professors who are in charge of each of the different houses. So Professor McGonagall is in charge of Gryffindor, which is where Harry and his 2 friends, Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger, all belong. So he makes friends with Ron and Hermione, and they start kind of having some adventures. And Harry joins a wizarding sport called Quidditch, which is played on brooms. And in one of the last chapters that we read, it was Harry's first Quidditch match, and someone seemed to take control of his broom. And we don't know who did it, but Ron and Hermione seem to think that it might have been Professor Snape. Professor Snape is the potions professor, and for some reason he seems like he really doesn't like Harry Potter, and we don't know why. But other things that have happened so far in the story, someone has let a troll into the school. They have discovered a 3-headed dog that seems to be guarding something. There's been a robbery at the wizard bank, Gringotts, and Harry and Ron seem to think that maybe the 3-headed dog is guarding what the robbers were trying to steal from the bank. And in the last chapter when we were reading, that was called The Mirror of Erised, Harry was gifted a cloak of invisibility that allowed him to kind of wander around the school a little bit. And he came upon this mirror that shows you anything that your heart truly desires. But Professor Dumbledore, who is kind of like the principal of the school, he's the headmaster, he found out that Harry was looking at it and told him that he was going to move the mirror somewhere else for his own safety, because people who looked at this mirror, sometimes they just want to sit there and look at the mirror and not do anything else because it shows them everything they want. So that's up to now. Now we're moving on to chapter 13. Chapter 13 is called Nicholas Flamel. And if you remember, that name has something to do with what the 3-headed dog was guarding, because Hagrid slipped up and told Ron and Harry and Hermione this, but we don't know who he is or what it's about. So let's read the chapter. Dumbledore had convinced Harry not to go looking for the Mirror of Erised again, and for the rest of the Christmas holidays, the invisibility cloak stayed folded at the bottom of his trunk. Harry wished he could forget what he'd seen in the mirror as easily, but he couldn't. He started having nightmares. Over and over again, he dreamed about his parents disappearing in a flash of green light while a high voice cackled with laughter. "You see, Dumbledore was right. That mirror could drive you mad," said Ron when Harry told him about these dreams. Hermione, who came back the day before term took a different view of things. She was torn between horror at the idea of Harry being out of bed roaming the school 3 nights in a row, if Filch had caught you, and disappointment that he hadn't at least found out who Nicholas Flamel was. They had almost given up hope of ever finding Flamel in a library book, even though Harry was still sure he'd read the name somewhere. Once term had started, they were back to skimming through books for 10 minutes during their breaks. Harry had even less time than the other two because Quidditch practice had started again. Wood was working the team harder than ever. Even the endless rain that had replaced the snow couldn't dampen his spirits. The Weasleys complained that Wood was becoming a fanatic, but Harry was on Wood's side. If they won their next match against Hufflepuff, they could overtake Slytherin in the house championship for the first time in 7 years. Quite apart from wanting to win, Harry found that he had fewer nightmares when he was tired out from training. Then, during one particularly wet and muddy practice session, Wood gave the team a bit of bad news. He just got very angry with the Weasleys, who kept dive-bombing each other and pretending to fall off their brooms. "Will you stop messing around?" he yelled. "That's exactly the sort of thing that'll lose us the match. Snape's refereeing this time, and he'll be looking for any excuse to knock points off Gryffindor." George Weasley really did fall off his broom at these words. "Snape's refereeing?" he sputtered through a mouthful of mud. "When's he ever refereed a Quidditch match? He's not going to be fair if we overtake Slytherin." The rest of the team landed next to George to complain too. "It's not my fault," said Wood. "We just got to make sure we play a clean game so Snape hasn't got an excuse to pick on us." Which was all very well, thought Harry, but he had another reason for not wanting Snape near him while he was playing Quidditch. The rest of the team hung back to talk to each other as usual at the end of practice, but Harry headed straight back to the Gryffindor common room, where he found Ron and Hermione playing chess. Chess was the only thing Hermione ever lost at, something Harry and Ron thought was very good for her. "Don't talk to me for a moment," said Ron when Harry sat down next to him. "I need to and then he caught sight of Harry's face. "What's the matter? You look terrible." Speaking quietly so that no one else could hear, Harry told the other two about Snape's sudden, sinister desire to be a Quidditch referee. "Don't play," said Hermione at once. "Say you're ill," said Ron. "Pretend to break your leg," Hermione suggested. "Really break your leg," said Ron. "I can't," said Harry. "There isn't a reserve seeker. If I back out, Gryffindor can't play at all." At that moment, Neville toppled into the common room. How he had managed to climb through the porthole was anyone's guess because his legs had been stuck together with what they recognized at once as the leg locker curse. He must have had to bunny hop all the way up to Gryffindor Tower. Everyone fell about laughing except Hermione, who leapt up and performed the counter curse. Neville's legs sprang apart and he got to his feet trembling. "What happened?" Hermione asked him, leading him over to sit with Harry and Ron. "Malfoy," said Neville shakily. "I met him outside the library. He said he'd been looking for someone to practice this on." "Go to Professor McGonagall," Hermione urged Neville. "Report him." Neville shook his head. "I don't want more trouble," he mumbled. "You've got to stand up to him, Neville," said Ron. "He's used to walking all over people, but that's no reason to lie down in front of him and make it easier." "There's no need to tell me I'm not brave enough to be in Gryffindor. Malfoy already's done that," Neville choked. Harry felt in the pocket of his robes and pulled out a chocolate frog, the very last one from the box Hermione had given him for Christmas. He gave it to Neville, who looked as though he might cry. "You're worth 12 of Malfoy," Harry said. "The Sorting Hat chose you for Gryffindor, didn't it? And where's Malfoy? And stinkin' Slytherin?" Neville's lips twitched in a weak smile as he unwrapped the frog. Thanks, Harry. I think we'll go to bed. Do you want the card? You collect them, don't you? As Neville walked away, Harry looked at the famous wizard card. Dumbledore again, he said. He's the first one I ever... He gasped. He stared at the back of the card. Then he looked up at Ron and Hermione. I found him, he whispered. I found Flamel! I told you I'd read the name somewhere before, and I read it on the train coming here. Listen to this. Professor Dumbledore is particularly famous for his defeat of the Dark Wizard Grindelwald in 1945, for the discovery of the 12 uses of dragon blood, and his work on alchemy with his partner, Nicholas Flamel. Hermione jumped to her feet. She hadn't looked so excited since they got back the marks for their very first piece of homework. Stay here, she said, and she sprinted up the stairs to the girls' dormitories. Harry and Ron barely had time to exchange mystified looks before she was dashing back, an enormous old book in her arms. I never thought to look in here, she whispered excitedly. I got this out of the library weeks ago for a bit of light reading. Light? Said Ron, but Hermione told him to be quiet until she looked something up and started flicking frantically through the pages, muttering to herself. At last she found what she was looking for. I knew it! I knew it! Are we allowed to speak yet? Said Ron grumpily. Hermione ignored him. Nicholas Flamel, she whispered dramatically, is the only known maker of the Philosopher's Stone. This didn't have quite the effect she'd expected. The what? Said Harry and Ron. Oh, honestly, don't you two read? Look, read that, there. She pushed the book towards them, and Harry and Ron read. The ancient study of alchemy is concerned with making the Philosopher's Stone, a legendary substance with astonishing powers. The stone will transform any metal into pure gold. It also produces the elixir of life, which will make the drinker immortal. There have been many reports of the Philosopher's Stone over the centuries, but the only stone currently in existence belongs to Mr. Nicholas Flamel, the noted alchemist and opera lover. Mr. Flamel, who celebrated his 665th birthday last year, enjoys a quiet life in Devon with his wife, Pernell, 658. See, said Hermione, when Harry and Ron had finished, the dog must be guarding Flamel's Philosopher's Stone. I bet he asked Dumbledore to keep it safe for him because they're friends, and he knew someone was out after it. That's why he wanted the stone moved out of Gringotts. A stone that makes gold and stops you ever dying, said Harry. No wonder Snape's after it. Anyone would want it. And no wonder we couldn't find Flamel in the study of recent developments in wizardry, said Ron. He's not actually recent if he's 665, is he? Next morning, in defense against the dark arts, while copying down different ways of treating werewolf bites, Harry and Ron were still discussing what they'd do with a Philosopher's Stone if they had one. It wasn't until Ron said he'd buy his own Quidditch team that Harry remembered about Snape and the coming match. I'm going to play, he told Ron and Hermione. If I don't, all of the Slytherins will think I'm just too scared to face Snape. I'll show them. I'll really wipe the smiles off their faces if we win. Just as long as we're not wiping you off the path, said Hermione. As the match drew nearer, however, Harry became more and more nervous. Whatever he told Ron and Hermione, the rest of the team weren't too calm either. The idea of overtaking Slytherin in the house championship was wonderful. No one had done it for nearly 7 years, but would they be allowed to, with such a biased referee? Harry didn't know whether he was imagining it or not, but he seemed to keep running into Snape wherever he went. At times, he even wondered whether Snape was following him, trying to catch him out on his own. Potion lessons were turning into a sort of weekly torture. Snape was so horrible to Harry. Could Snape possibly know they'd found out about the Philosopher's Stone? Harry didn't see how he could, yet he sometimes had the horrible feeling that Snape could read minds. Harry knew, when they wished him good luck outside the changing room next afternoon, that Ron and Hermione were wondering whether they'd ever see him alive again. This wasn't what you'd call comforting. Harry hardly heard a word of Wood's pep talk as he pulled on his Quidditch robes and picked up his Nimbus 2000. Ron and Hermione, meanwhile, had found a place in the stands next to Neville, who couldn't understand why they looked so grim and worried, or why they had both brought their wands to the match. Little did Harry know that Ron and Hermione had been secretly practicing the leg locker curse. They'd got the idea from Malfoy using it on Neville, and were ready to use it on Snape if he showed any signs of wanting to hurt Harry. Now don't forget, it's Locomotor Mortis, Hermione muttered as Ron slipped his wand up his sleeve. I know, said Ron. Don't nag. Back in the changing room, Wood had taken Harry aside. I don't want to pressure you now, Potter, but if we ever needed an early capture of the snitch, it's now. Finish the game before Snape can favor Hufflepuff too much. The whole school's out there, said Fred Weasley, peering out the door. Even, blimey, Dumbledore's come to watch. Harry's heart did a somersault. Dumbledore, he said, dashing to the door to make sure. Fred was right. There was no mistaking the silver beard. Harry could have laughed out loud with relief. He was safe. There was simply no way that Snape would dare to try and hurt him if Dumbledore was watching. Perhaps that was why Snape was looking so angry as the teams marched onto the pitch, something that Ron noticed too. I've never seen Snape look so mean, he told Hermione. Look, they're off. Ouch. Someone had poked Ron in the back of the head. It was Malfoy. Oh, sorry, Weasley. Didn't see you there. Malfoy grinned broadly at Crabbe and Goyle. Wonder how long Potter's going to stay on his broom this time. Anyone want to bet? What about you, Weasley? Ron didn't answer. Snape had just awarded Hufflepuff a penalty because George Weasley had hit a bludger at him. Hermione, who had all her fingers crossed in her lap, was squinting fixedly at Harry, who was circling the game like a hawk, looking for the snitch. You know how I think they choose people for the Gryffindor team, said Malfoy, loudly a few minutes later, as Snape awarded Hufflepuff another penalty for no reason at all. It's people they feel sorry for. See, there's Potter, who's got no parents. Then there's the Weasleys, who've got no money. You should be on that team, Longbottom. You've got no brains. Neville went bright red, but turned in his seat to face Malfoy. I'm worth 12 of you, Malfoy, he stammered. Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle howled with laughter, but Ron, still not daring to take his eyes from the game, said, You tell him, Neville. Longbottom, if brains were gold, you'd be poorer than Weasley, and that's saying something. Ron's nerves were already stretched to breaking point with anxiety about Harry. I'm warning you, Malfoy, one more word. Ron, said Hermione suddenly. Harry! What? Where? Harry had suddenly gone into a spectacular dive, which drew gasps and cheers from the crowd. Hermione stood up, her crossed fingers in her mouth, as Harry streaked towards the ground like a bullet. You're in luck, Weasley. Potter's obviously spotted some money on the ground, said Malfoy. Ron snapped. Before Malfoy knew what was happening, Ron was on top of him, wrestling him to the ground. Neville hesitated, then clambered over the back of his seat to help. Come on, Harry! Hermione screamed, leaping onto her seat to watch as Harry sped straight at Snape. She didn't even notice Malfoy and Ron rolling around under her seat, or the scuffles and yelps coming from the whirl of fists that was Neville, Crabbe, and Goyle. Up in the air, Snape turned on his broomstick just in time to see something scarlet shoot past him, missing him by inches. Next second, Harry had pulled out of the dive, his arm raised in triumph, the snitch clasped in his hand. The stands erupted. It had to be a record. No one could ever remember the snitch being caught so quickly. Ron, where are you? The game's over. Harry's won. We've won. Gryffindor's in the lead, shrieked Hermione, dancing up and down on her seat and hugging Pravati Patel in the row in front. Harry jumped off his broom, a foot from the ground. He couldn't believe it. He'd done it. The game was over. It had barely lasted 5 minutes. As Gryffindors came spilling onto the pitch, he saw Snape land nearby, white-faced and tight-lipped. Then Harry felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up into Dumbledore's smiling face. "Well done," said Dumbledore quietly, so that only Harry could hear. "Nice to see you haven't been brooding about that mirror. Been keeping busy. Excellent." Snape spat bitterly on the ground. Harry left the changing room alone some time later to take his Nimbus 2000 back to the broom shed. He couldn't ever remember feeling happier. He'd really done something to be proud of now. No one could say he was just a famous name anymore. The evening air had never smelled so sweet. He walked over the damp grass, reliving the last hour in his head, which was a happy blur. Gryffindors running to lift him onto their shoulders, Ron and Hermione in the distance jumping up and down, Ron cheering through a heavy nosebleed. Harry had reached the shed. He leaned against the wooden door and looked up at Hogwarts with its windows glowing red in the setting sun. Gryffindor in the lead. He'd done it. He'd shown Snape. And speaking of Snape, a hooded figure came swiftly down the front steps of the castle. Clearly not wanting to be seen, it walked as fast as possible towards the Forbidden Forest. Harry's victory faded from his mind as he watched. He recognized the figure's prowling walk. Snape sneaked into the forest while everyone else was at dinner. What was going on? Harry jumped back on his Nimbus 2000 and took off. Gliding silently over the castle, he saw Snape enter the forest at a run. He followed. The trees were so thick he couldn't see where Snape had gone. He flew in circles lower and lower, brushing the top branches of trees until he heard voices. He glided towards them and landed noiselessly in a towering beech tree. He climbed carefully along one of the branches, holding tight to his broomstick, trying to see through the leaves. Below, in a shadowy clearing, stood Snape, but he wasn't alone. Quirrell was there too. Harry couldn't make out the look on his face, but he was stuttering worse than ever. Harry strained to catch what they were saying. "Don't know why you wanted to meet me here, of all places, Severus." "Oh, I thought we'd keep this private," said Snape, his voice icy. "Students aren't allowed to know about the Philosopher's Stone, after all." Harry leaned forward. Quirrell was mumbling something. Snape interrupted him. "Have you found out how to get past that beast of Hagrid's yet?" But Severus, "You don't want me for your enemy, Quirrell," said Snape, taking a step towards him. "I don't know what you..." "You know perfectly well what I mean." An owl hooted loudly, and Harry nearly fell out of the tree. He steadied himself in time to hear Snape say, "Your little bit of hocus-pocus. I'm waiting." But I don't..." "Very well," Snape cut in. "We'll have another little chat soon when you've had time to think things over and decided where your loyalties lie." He threw his cloak over his head and strode out of the clearing. It was almost dark now, but Harry could see Quirrell standing quite still as though he were petrified. "Harry, where have you been?" Hermione squeaked. "We won! You won! We won!" shouted Ron, thumping Harry on the back. "And I gave Malfoy a black eye, and Neville tried to take on Crabbe and Goyle single-handed. He's still out cold, but Madame Pomfrey says he'll be all right. Talk about showing Slytherin. Everyone's waiting for you in the common room. We're having a party. Fred and George stole some cakes and stuff from the kitchen." "Never mind that now," said Harry breathlessly. "Let's find an empty room. You wait till you hear this." He made sure Peeves wasn't inside before shutting the door. Then he told them what he'd seen and heard. "So you were right, it is the Philosopher's Stone, and Snape's trying to force Quirrell to help him get it. He asked if he knew how to get past Fluffy, and he said something about Quirrell's hocus-pocus. I reckon there are other things guarding the stone apart from Fluffy, loads of enchantments probably, and Quirrell could have done some anti-dark art spell, which Snape needs to break through." "So you mean that the stone's only safe as long as Quirrell stands up to Snape?" said Hermione in alarm. "It'll be gone by next Tuesday," said Ron. And that's the end of chapter 13. So, this chapter, it's very interesting. It's very interesting that Nicholas Flamel, the name Nicholas Flamel was under Harry's nose the whole time. So here's what I would like for you to do for me today. After you've listened to this chapter, I would like for you to make for me a Dumbledore chocolate frog card. When I think of the chocolate frog cards, I picture something that's kind of like a baseball card or maybe a hockey card with a picture of the wizard on it and maybe a little bit of information on the bottom. What I would like for you to do is I would like for you to take a piece of paper. So pretend this is my piece of paper. Up at the top, I want a picture in here of Dumbledore. And down at the bottom, I want you to write some information about Dumbledore. So it could be, you know, he is the head of Hogwarts. He has a long beard. He's friends with Nicholas Flamel. This chapter told us some stuff about Dumbledore. So if you can't remember, you can always go back and listen again. But that's what I would like for you to do. Make me a chocolate frogs card of Dumbledore. And you can decorate it how you think it might look. So imagine you received this chocolate frog and you opened it up, and underneath the frog was this card all about your favorite wizard. And this wizard happens to be Dumbledore. Okay? Post this to Fresh Grade underneath this chapter, and I will talk with you again soon.